Hello. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I am with Michelle Olivier,
Yeah.
and we are going to be talking about DEI and the future of DEI in the workplace. I think we both have, I want to, I'm assuming we have some different perspectives on this because I do follow you very closely, Michelle. So I am excited to get going. I think right now is a really good time for those of us in DEI space or for those of us interested in DEI because so many companies are working on creating this more inclusive environment. Now, the equity isn't always there, but they want to appear very inclusive. It's very popular right now. So, what are your thoughts on that? On the popularity of appearing inclusive and diverse as opposed to actually how to incorporate that equity piece that is the most important piece, I think.
Oh, see, I don't know that. I don't know that there's any of the pieces that are more important than the others. We'll talk about that in a second. But in terms of like performative DEI initiative, I think that it's the bane of most of our existences, right? It's the same
Mm-hmm.
thing as the companies that, like, in June are all going to have rainbows for their logos. And then at the same time, they're not going to have, they're not going to support same sex adoption in their healthcare policies or their leave entitlement policies. They're not going to support, like, they're not going to make sure that they have medical benefits that cover trans medical needs, be that, medication or surgeries or or alignment surgeries or any of that. So there's so much performative
Mm-hmm.
marketing BS around DEI that I think it makes it very difficult for people who are increasingly conscientious about that in the market to be able to distinguish who is a true DEI enthusiast and ally, um, and who are people who want to have a, perfect rainbow of skin tone in the
Mm-hmm.
photo on their careers page. It's like, look, we hire brown people. And I think that there's not a great answer other than I think that one of the things that we have to allow culturally is for organizations to admit being wrong without being demonized. So
Yeah.
one of the things we're really bad at is when somebody gets found out for bad practice, we're all like, they're awful, they do this, and then they get really demonized really fast, which then all that does is make people feel bad about admitting mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, the outcry should be, great, now you realize that. What have you done about it?
Yeah, and it also, I think can lead to a fear of even getting involved,
Yes.
right? Because they're like, oh, well, if we don't do this right, then we could, face a lot of more backlash. So let's just not even try. I think
Yeah.
that can be just as damaging. But you're right. I agree. There has to be a way out or a way to have conversations about things that aren't, so black and white. Like, I really hate this whole black and white culture we're creating right now where everything's either right or wrong. You're either with us or against us. Like, there's no gray area.
Well, and I think for me, like, so people look at me now and they're like, oh, she's so out there and vocal about being so progressive. And I've been accused of being woke, and I would never self describe that way in 1,000 years. Now, what I
Mm-hmm.
am is a um, later life, technically a geriatric mom, which is a great title that everybody wants to be called. But I'm a later life mom of small children. I am a queer, um, cis woman, and I am Native American, right? So, like, all of those things all at the same time. And so there's a lot, and I'm neurodivergent. So I'm a lot of DEI boxes getting checked all at the same time. And so I read a great article a while back that said if you change where you sit, it changes where you stand. And I think that what they meant by that was that if you sit at the affluent white cis hetero table all the time, it's really easy to have a stance that says that, you know, institutional racism is not a thing, that institutional misogyny is not a thing, because where you're sitting, you don't even have a view of those seats necessarily, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you suddenly find yourself at one of those tables, things turn. So, um, I know I have made mistakes. I know I have been not an ally to all kinds of people in all of those groups, including groups that I'm a member of, right, over time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, I try to be really upfront about that. I have, as an HR person, literally said about pregnant women, like who were suffering with morning sickness, saying, "Well, here's what I'm going to say. If she knows that she throws up for 2 hours when she wakes up every morning, and she knows we have a 9 a.m. meeting, I suggest she get up a little bit earlier."
Mm-hmm.
In retrospect, that's insane. Like, that's a totally insane way of looking at things. It was terrible. But absolutely, but I did it, and I own it, and I would never say it now, and I would call out
Mm-hmm.
anybody else who did. But I think that we have to be very cognizant in calling out bad behaviors, to not do so aggressively that we don't allow people to admit when they've made a mistake and learn and grow from it. Because
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, what we know about institutional racism, institutional misogyny, is that we're all making that mistake all the time. Like, we're it's
Mm-hmm.
almost like saying that somebody is racist. Well, they also breathe air. Like, we don't need to say that. It's understood.
Yeah.
You grew up in this country, you are racist. So calling each other that, are we achieving something other than demonization? I think I've squirreled out and kind of strayed from the point, but to kind of bring it back to what you're saying, I think that organizations have to be mindful of the same thing. That organizations have to be willing to confront their demons, and the ones that I would be drawn to, that are the ones that to me are more than just acting out, we love suddenly DEI initiatives, are the ones who are acknowledging their demons, who do have a roadmap for, like, hey, these are the things that we've noticed that we've done wrong, and this is
Mm-hmm.
what we're going to do to fix it.
Yeah, I love that. And, I think every company's changed because our culture's changed, right? Like, I think me and you are the same generation around about. So we've grown up with that, that's gay phrase that if you remember in the 90s, that was so popular. And
Hmm.
it was even on TV shows, and like you watch old Friends episodes now, and there's stuff in there that's very offensive to us now. But at the time, it wasn't, right? It was just normal everyday life.
Absolutely. Prince was
So,
progressive at the time, right? Like,
yeah, yeah,
there was
totally.
no slut shaming in Friends.
Hmm.
Like, there were so many things about Friends that was really progressive, and it's a great example, right? That you look back now and you just think, "Oh my god!" Like, the
Hmm.
predatory behavior of Joey Tribbiani, like, it's not funny anymore. And it definitely, right? Like, I think that it's a really good reminder to all of us that needles have moved, and for the better.
Yeah.
But that, we all have to learn, we all have to grow, and we all have to be doing it all the time.
Yeah. And, something that I think you brought up, like, you know, being in a racist culture and being in this misogynistic culture as well. I find myself now more aware of what is impacting women of color on a daily basis, and those things are just so woven into the culture that you don't even necessarily, you have to really think and look for those things, and then start wondering, why do I consistently accept this? Like,
Absolutely.
and it's actually effort that you have to do every single day. So I think that effort and that energy, not everyone has it, right? And not everyone is going to be putting in the same thought. And I think corporations, it's the same way. Luckily, I am in a corporation now where I feel like 100% fit, and I think they're doing a lot of work in the DEI space that is actually positive. And when you are listing things like covering your partner, they do that, you know, covering partner adoption, they do that. So a lot of those things we're doing, and also showing up all year, right? I think that's the important part. Like, not just June, because June is Pride Month, so I'll be celebrating, and it's great to celebrate. And it is important to hold that month special and to think about all of the things that went into having rights, right? Like being able to have marriage in some states, I guess, not everywhere, but you know, having that time to reflect and to really bring attention to LGBTQIA issues. And I think that it's a hard line, right? Like I see, well, we don't want to just talk about June, but then, yeah, June is nice, right? It's a nice gift to give and to share and to talk and celebrate. But we do want to have those conversations year round, right?
Well, for
I don't know.
me, like, I would love to see that June is the month where we celebrate some new milestone we've achieved, specifically in fixing something that we were doing wrong around those issues, right? Not that
Hmm.
that's when we suddenly had the conversation to identify it. Not that that's when we give ourselves 30 days to do the work and then we're done. But like literally every June, we throw a party that says, hey, man, 5 years ago, we put this rule into place. And at the time, it seemed like a good idea. And now we realize that that was super transphobic for the following 30 reasons. We are so excited to announce this June that we have reversed that policy. Here's what we've done better instead. Good,
Hmm.
we're excited that we learned and grew this year. Let's see what we can find to make better for next year. Like to me, that's what I would like to see whatever the celebration month du jour is, right? So for, Black History Month, for Women's History Month, those types of things like, hey, here's the thing that we realized this month that we
Hmm.
had realized last year that was, a way that we were continuing to not celebrate, to not be, hear Black voices or incorporate them. And here's the four things that we've done to fix it. And like have that be what we're celebrating rather than having things be about, you know, we're going to act, we're going to put a sheen on it, a veneer of engagement, but with no actual policy change that aligns to that. And I think that that's, to me, that's where it has to move to. And I think um, a lot of that has to do with more of the inclusion than the diversity and the equity. I think that in terms of moving forward from an equity perspective, ultimately, and this is a fairly radical belief, but mine is that we have a really unfair system, a
Hmm.
bad system. We have a system that some people are so incredibly disenfranchised from that they literally have no idea what the options are. You
Hmm.
can't negotiate for something that you didn't know was an option.
Yeah.
Right? That's not on you, and I get so irritated at the rhetoric around, "Well, women need to be better negotiators." No, they don't. We need to quit having this idea that this adversarial engagement is somehow innately valuable and a measure of somebody's worth. You can
Hmm.
be, the best project manager or best programmer in the whole wide world and not be a great negotiator in a bad and fixed game, and that doesn't mean you deserve to be paid less.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, it's all about transparency. I really think that the only way that we fix it, the only way we level the playing field is by just being 100% transparent about what the job is, what the benefits are, and what the pay is. And I think that Colorado has taken some steps towards that, and well done. I think, I know that I have peers who I value and appreciate and celebrate their opinions on a lot of things, and they vehemently disagree with me about including pay ranges. That I
Hmm.
think that their argument about, well, but pay ranges are complicated, I just call bullshit. Like every public sector job in this country already has advertised pay range. If your pay range is so complicated that you can't put down a budget, then that's part of a problem.
Mhm.
That says that you are perpetuating a bad and rigged system. You're perpetuating a system
Mhm.
in which you have to know the right questions in order to negotiate. And it's on all sorts of things. And people are like, "Oh, I didn't realize that I could negotiate on start date." Why not? I didn't realize I could negotiate on, days of leave. Why not? And there's so
See,
many people that have, like, uncapped PTO, and they're like, "Well, Michelle, like, I really wanna take this job, but it pays less than this other one." Great. Well, what could they do that would level the playing field? Well, I mean, it's something crazy like I have, a 4-day week. Why the hell not? They have uncapped PTO.
mhm.
Negotiate that. Say, "Great. If we can agree at 440, I'm in." And people
Yeah,
are like,
it's
"Didn't occur to me I could do that. Why not?"
see, I didn't think of any of the things that you've talked about, but I have like I
And
grew
you're a
up.
good negotiator, right? Like, so
I don't know. Well, now I am better negotiating from the business perspective on behalf of the company that employs me, right? Like I'm very comfortable in that scenario. Whereas negotiating for myself and for the job, that's all kind of mushy to me. And it's actually something I learn along the way. Like I grew up in poverty. I didn't have parents that were established. I didn't have anyone to learn this stuff from. So it's like when I got my first job, I had no idea you were supposed to negotiate. I was just happy that they hired me, right? Like, and I see that a lot in women that come to me for mentoring, and they're not 100% sure of what the steps are or what to do when they're entering the field either. I think it can be common like for women especially not to have that guidance, and you don't really learn that in college. I have an MBA. We didn't have a class on like when you get your job and you negotiate what, there wasn't that class about just the common sense stuff. So, yeah, I think I lack a lot of that common sense stuff or negotiating on behalf of myself.
but again, you know what? I really feel like we even in that what you just said, like, you're framing it as like this is common sense. Well, it's not common sense. It's a
Hmm.
secret handshake that nobody taught you the secret handshake. And I think that it's an innately adversarial thing. And
Yeah.
who does that system benefit? Well, it benefits neurotypical people
Hmm.
from positions of historic power and know-how. So white cis hetero men
Hmm.
or neurotypical is who the current system of negotiation benefits. So if we want to stop grossly, weighting things in their favor, then we don't even change the game. We just cancel it. Quit having a game. Like
Yeah.
I genuinely don't understand an employee-employer relationship. First of all, there's this archaic paradigm that the employers are in charge and they're somehow doing the employee a favor by
Hmm.
hiring them, that they are owed loyalty. I have even straight-faced had people tell me that employees owe fealty. Like that literally no sense of irony. Totally believe that that was true. I'm like, do you make them kiss the ring when they what? Like, they genuinely believe that, and over we hear this still from hiring managers, right? Like, "Well, a loyal employee" no, screw you and your loyalty. This is a business contractual relationship. That is all that it is.
Hmm.
And so but it is a business contractual relationship that becomes a huge part of somebody's life. And so acknowledging that it has therefore that emotive component to it, as all
Hmm.
business relationships do, right, is important. But part of that is saying, look, we're just going to put our cards on the table. These are the things that we can negotiate on. These are the things we can't. This is our banding for the job. This is specifically why we gave you the offer that we did based on the fact that, for this much experience on this, for scores of this in interview, we like map it out, have it be totally transparent and then let candidates know. How much better would that feel? coming in,
Mhm.
right? To feel like you're coming in, like, I know exactly why I make exactly what I do. And I know that if the woman sitting next to me is making 20K a year more, I know what she has demonstrated to the company that got her that additional, and I know what I need, therefore what I need to do to earn it.
Mhm.
And I think that until we have that level of transparency with everybody, that we're not going to have equity. And is it going to make some people uncomfortable? Yes, change always does.
Mhm.
So your employees' discomfort is just not something that I really give a fig about. Like, I feel like across the board, we just need to say, hey, this is a bad system that holds people down, and we're going to stop playing it. So going forth,
Mhm.
this is what everybody makes.
Well,
Good job.
I think also Americans are a little bit uptight about that, right? Like I have friends in other countries and they'll just flat out ask you how much do you make a year, right? And it's no big deal to them and they just kind of talk about it like we feel like, "Oh my gosh, I would never say that or I would never talk about that when I'm at dinner with my friends. Why would, like money is just kind of like secret
And
and secrets cause problems, right?"
they
Like
absolutely do. Absolutely. And I feel like, going along with that, so obviously I lived for 10 and a half years in the UK. My husband is English. Huge percentage of our friends are. I mean, talk about uptight about money. The Brits have it at a different level of lockdown, right? Like if if they were allowed to talk about money, they still would not from a cultural perspective. In the US, there is a lot of pressure within organizations to not talk about salary. I have
mhm,
seen organizations who have had rules. It is actually illegal to tell employees that they can't discuss their finances. It's actually illegal to tell employees because it's all part of like the anti-union laws, right? Like, thank God for unions that they gave people those rights. You're absolutely allowed to walk around and tell anybody in a company exactly what you make. It is your data. They don't own that. You can tell anybody you want. Go straight through
mhm,
the street, say, "Hey, friend, how's it going? I make 25 grand." I mean, like, you can say whatever you want. It's your information. The only reason that employers don't want you doing that is because they have a bad system and they know it. It's a self-awareness of the fact that they are perpetuating injustice and imbalance, and they should really be ashamed. And I think that
mhm,
any employer that cannot explain to you, I understand that there's a concern around churn, right? That if you just rip the Band-Aid off and say, right, guys, we listened to this, live broadcast with Michelle and Tia the other day, and they were so smart and right. We've decided we're just going to post everybody's earnings on the board starting next month. The people are going to freak out and people will leave, and that you need to, mitigate for that risk. I get it. So have a plan. This is where we're going to get to. Over the next 18 months, we are moving towards a radically transparent system. Here's what that's going to look like. And
mhm,
then slowly, slowly catchy monkey, bring people along because, I mean, change management, right? But like that kind of thing is what really needs to happen. And for me, any company that does not have a change management system in place for how they're going to get from the old terrible system to a new system of transparency around wage and remuneration is a company that's not actually invested in equity.
mhm. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, my company is doing a lot in this space because they have found a, disproportionate salary between the men and the women of the organization. So we've had several town halls where they're discussing the rollout of the plan to fix that. So you're right, it's like a staged process that's going to take, I think, I don't even know, I think within a year, but it may be 18 months. But they're looking at different stages of how they're going to correct that. And then they will give us updates along the way. So they've been very transparent about that. And I think it's amazing to work at a place like that because you feel like you're a person, right? Like it matters that you're there and that they see you and they're going to explain to you what's happening. I've worked at companies before where everything is like secret behind closed doors and no one knows anything. And oh, there's a rollout of layoffs, and everyone freaks out because no one knows why or how or who is going to be targeted. And working like that is so stressful. Um, those high pressured positions, I guess, where they want you. I think it's almost like management wants you on your toes all the time to think you could get laid off at any moment. I can't function in that environment.
And it's really interesting. So like I said, my husband is English, and in the UK they have employment contracts, which is not something we have in the US. And
Mm-hmm.
in your employment contract, it's very clear around things like notice. And so it is, I think it's 4 weeks notice is at least it was when I was last recruiting there. 4 weeks notice was the usual. More senior people got up to 12 weeks notice, even
Mm-hmm.
sometimes. And that was on both sides. So the company could not just walk in and be like, you know what, we've decided today, we decided we hate your face. There's the door, right? There had to be, and within those contracts as well, it outlined a very clear process that the company would have to go through in order for you to lose your job. So
Mm-hmm.
the result was fascinating for me, right? As an employee, I was like, so wait a minute. Y'all can't just like fire me because I was a bitch today. All right. And it was it was very liberating in a lot of ways. Now, are there a billion cultural silent rules and other ways that they can hamper your career and, force you out? Of course there are. But it was very galvanizing to know that I was going to have 4 weeks notice to find a new job if I needed one,
Mm-hmm.
and that I was not gonna be confused along the way of what was happening, because there were gonna be these clearly laid out 1, 2, 3 steps before I got to the 4 weeks notice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And my husband obviously had grown up in that, and we came over here and he was like, "I don't understand. We don't have a contract." And I was like, "No."
Mm-hmm.
He was like, "How do I know they're gonna pay me?" Good point.
But I think in UK, don't you have a um, what is it called? Like a testing period where your
Probation.
probation period, like first. So you have to be doing a good job, really, before they consider you an employee with your full rights under the contract, right?
It depends. Some companies have a probation period, some companies don't. It's dependent. In general, somewhere between 30 and 90-day probation, is pretty normal, but even then, there's clear benchmarks. There's clear rules, like,
Mm-hmm.
great, for your probationary period, this is what you don't have access to, this is what you do have access to at the end of probation. This is what is involved in passing your probation, and it, like, legally has to be very, very explicit, and for them to just get to the end of the probation, be like, "Ah,
Mm-hmm.
nah, that's not a thing." Like, they would have to be able to demonstrate that that it wasn't just a discriminatory issue, that it was something that you had done, um, it was a performance-related issue. I think
Mm-hmm.
that it it radically changes employee comfort with the company, and for good and ill, right? Like, one of the jokes in the UK is they've been here for 3 years, which means we can't fire them. So, there's this perception that after a certain amount of time, people just put their feet up and there's no longer a pressure to perform. There's not a pressure to innovate. There's not a pressure to drive, because as long as I keep doing the minimal standard, you can't fire me. So, okay. I don't know that that always tracks, but that is one of, like, the cultural jokes and sort of assumptions about things. So there's good and ill, around it, but it is very interesting that, in our country, every single thing, every single policy, with the exception of a very small number that were hard fought for, um, are there to protect the employer and only the
Hmm.
employer. You know,
Yeah.
we don't have a national tribunal system that makes it free and easy for people to pursue discrimination claims against employers.
Hmm.
It's all well and good as a HR person that I can tell you that no, it's illegal to discriminate against a woman because she's pregnant. But also, what would you do about it? What would you do?
Nothing. Yeah, nothing. I have,
Right? Are you, as a
yeah.
pregnant woman, going to go and retain an attorney, spend the thousands of dollars, hundreds of hours it would take to
Hmm.
actually sue that employer? No, no.
Yeah. I mean, I think I myself in my past positions have come into quite a few situations that were discriminatory where it felt like, well, I can't complain, right? Like I can't do anything about it because, like, what are you going to do? You can't really, like the states, there's not really a plan, I guess. And something that I found very interesting is I worked for a small, very small local company at one point, and they were so small they didn't have to abide by any of these like general rules that the larger companies have to abide by, right? Like they don't have to provide you health insurance, they don't have to do all these things. But the people that owned the company were also very progressive and like wanted, all of these things. And I said, one day I said, well, why are you always complaining about women's rights, but you don't even offer maternity leave? And their response to me was, well, we want the federal government to do that. What?
Yeah, no, I 100%. I own a small company, and we have hired people in the past, and we have had those really real conversations like, hey, we want to hire someone, and we think that if you work, that we believe very strongly, everybody at my organization is a huge proponent of universal health care. Huge proponent. We
Hmm.
genuinely believe that healthcare is a fundamental human right. Does ONH Consulting provide healthcare to their staff? No, we do not.
Hmm.
And there's all kinds of reasons for that. Not least of which is we don't technically have any staff. Everybody is a 1099 employee, and that's another thing, right? Like technically, those people have fewer rights, etc. But it is
Hmm.
an administrative burden that we're not able to do. Now, I've spoken to my employees. They are okay with it. They have other options. We do things to help, but I completely, at a personal level as well as an ideological one, understand like that divide, right? Like great intention, but also there is a practicality involved with some of
Hmm.
this stuff. Um, I would argue that your example of maternity leave is not a great example of that. That like they totally could have offered maternity leave, but
Yeah.
but it's like the argument about, well, people want to make too much money these days to work for you, and your labor is not worth such and so. And my answer is everybody deserves a living wage. Everybody. And if you can't afford to pay a living wage, then it's not because there's a labor shortage, it's because you can't afford to be in business.
Yeah. Yeah, I
It-
agree. It's
you know
and so going back to the DEI, I think I don't know. I feel like we're not like we're around the DEI issue, but not the issue that I wanted to really talk about, which is right now it's trend. What do we think it's going to be in 10 years? Is it going to be better environment, or are things going to kind of ebb and flow and go back to the way that they were? I mean, sometimes we see progression and then things just go backwards. We're seeing that in Florida and Texas. I mean, like lots of legislation that is way backwards.
as a resident of the state of Texas, believe me, I am clear on how backwards we are getting, and how fast. I think that I am concerned that there was a trend to hire a DEI officer, and everybody scrambled to do that. And we did not have in place a clear definition of what that is, what that does, what that's accountable for, or
Mhm.
where that fits within a traditional corporate model, right? Like if you so here's kind of what I mean by that. If I say to you, I'm the chief people officer for XYZ Corp, you're very clear on broadly what I do,
Mhm.
where I sit broadly organizationally, and what that would look like. If I said to you, I'm chief DEI officer, that could mean almost anything.
Mhm.
That could mean I am the token brown chick at the senior level, and so I get to sit in the board, but actually have no direct responsibilities. And we have seen that. We have seen companies that literally they have no direct reports. They have no um, organizational like feed up to them. They have no direct policy control. They have a title and they're there to influence, which is not
Mhm.
quantifiable or specific. And so I think that we are, as kind of a community, people who celebrates the idea of having a chief DEI officer, now almost like we have, this great cart and now we're trying to find the right horse to put in front of it. Um,
Mhm.
and so we're creating DEI certification programs and, master's programs for DEI. We're creating some functional standards about what this means and what this looks like. And we're starting to have the dialogues, because is it does being a queer non-white woman mean that I am a DEI expert? No, it means that I have a very clear lived experience around
Mhm.
those elements.
Yeah.
And, I certainly, as an expert in some things, can speak to policies about those things, but I am not an expert in DEI in and of itself. And I'm always
Mhm.
very clear to make that delineation. But in terms of what does make those people, how do we know what should DEI be doing? Who should be who should report to them? Where should they sit within the organization? What is their functional area other than advice and guidance, which is like corporate for thoughts and prayers? What does that mean and look like? And I feel like until we get the answer to those questions, we don't really know what the future of DEI is going to be.
Yeah, I think for me it's a bit scary because I see what you mentioned, like this kind of rush to get a DEI in place, and some companies are doing a really great job of that, and they have a structure and they have a reporting in place. And then other companies are just actually changing the HR person's name to now include DEI, right? And that person never had any additional training, or they don't know, right? They could be like white, cis, absolutely no diversity, and they're just making that person be the diversity person because they need to have that on paper. And I fear that that will kind of burn out, and people will see, oh well, this person really isn't, because they're not trained, and because they didn't hire or create a structure, they're going to say, well, we're not seeing any changes, so we're going to do away with that role and just go back to calling that person like HR lead or whatever they were before. So that is my worry, is that if companies are quick to create and brand that they're in this space, but they're not doing the effort and the work, then it's just going to all fizzle out.
Absolutely. And I think that honestly, companies don't understand what the work means. So, a really good friend of mine, Yvonne Alstrom, who, if you don't follow her, you should, is a DEI specialist and she is a DEI consultancy. And she goes in, and the first thing she has to do is help the organization understand what they are going to do, that they have to begin by assessing the problem. And there are all kinds of research and metrics and a whole list of things that they go through, and they crunch the numbers to come up with, all right, so where are we? The hardest one
Mhm.
to quantify, at least to my brain, the one that I would struggle with the most is the integration, right? I have clear solutions that my super logical brain is like, I understand how we fix equity. We just, transparency does a lot to fix it. Great. Diversity. I I think we all have a pretty good idea, right? That means that we hire more people who are different. Check. Um,
Mhm.
but the inclusion component, like how do we measure how inclusive we are in once they're there and throughout all of our processes and getting them there? Man, that's a lot tougher,
Mhm.
a lot harder to quantify because how do you let people know, like your example of, you worked at companies where you felt a lot of discrimination, you did not feel able to comment. How do you make it safe for people to say that? But I think also, how do you help people understand that the general discomfort that they feel is about something that is DEI in nature? And like, so here's what I mean by that. I worked for an organization where the VP and the director would sit around, both white cis hetero males, would sit around in the lunchroom and make off color jokes,
Mhm.
often of a graphic sexual nature, and make other jokes about people who, non straight, non cis members of staff, about physical prowess or stamina or what have you. Now, a lot of people felt uncomfortable about that. Like it was an awkward feeling. We didn't really love it. There was a sense that you had to sit there and smile and laugh, or it was
Mhm.
not cool. Organizationally, those things as an HR professional, I'm like, that is sexual harassment and creating of a hostile workplace. That is
Mhm.
not cool. If you had asked those same people who felt uncomfortable sat in that room, do you feel you have been sexually harassed? They would immediately and probably pretty aggressively said, "Of course not. Mr. VP would never do that. He's a really nice guy." Mhm. Because you thought I asked, "Did he slap your ass?" Or did he tell you that he's gonna fire you if you don't sleep with him? What I
Mhm.
asked was something very different, and I think that, you know, when you're looking to measure things like integration, for different communities, like, that's one of the barriers you have to get through, is how do we let them understand that those, sexually explicit jokes that you had to smile and nod to are every bit as much sexual harassment as when they smack your ass. And, like, yes, I
Mhm.
understand that you had a preconceived notion that that label was here, but actually it includes all of these things, and that it's okay to call it out. So that is part of the work they do. Like, that's the stuff that I have no idea how the hell to
Mhm.
quantify that. Would not even begin. My first step, honestly, would be to call Yvonne and say, "Girl, what's your hourly rate? Let's ride." Right? Because I do not know, and I don't have that level of expertise. I know that there are people who do, and they are worth all of the money that they get paid, and probably a hell of a lot more in most instances. But as a marketplace, we don't know how to measure their success. And it's a new enough position that we don't have people who have 15 years of experience with major deliverables and ways
Mhm.
to demonstrate, what they achieve, because we just haven't been doing it that long. And so
Yeah.
all of those things together leave it in this area where you're right, it is in danger of being subsumed by HR,
Mhm.
or going away as a fad of the moment because nobody knew how to quantify it. People hired people immediately, got no results from it. because they didn't set them up for success and results, and then went,
Hmm.
this is a waste of business money. Eyes are off this position. Great, let's move on.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, well, a couple of things you said that really stuck out to me is like creating a safe space and like how do we create safe spaces. And I would say that not all companies want to create safe spaces. And so they're not doing the work because they like things the way that they are. And like earlier when you said like that woke word, you know, like they'll kind of brush it off like, oh, that's some woke nonsense or something, right? Like they don't want to change. And so I don't know, it's so hard to tell like where you work has to be aligned with your beliefs and your thoughts, but then what if it's not? And then you know you can't speak out because it's not a safe space and they didn't create the safe space and they don't want to. And they may be having a DEI person, but it means something completely different to them than it would mean to you to have that position, right? It's not about actually having diversity.
Absolutely. Well, and I think it's interesting. There's a lot of roles in general with the human systems in business that people really undervalue until it's there. So, for example, one of the companies I work with, I am freshly minted their head of talent, and I handle everything HR for the whole organization.
Mm-hmm.
And when the CEO asked me if I would be down for doing it, and I was like, I mean, sure, I don't have hobbies or kids. It sounds great. Why not? Um, and I took on the mantle, and he was like, we just don't have a lot of this stuff. I feel like it's gonna be, like, maybe, like, 3 more hours a month that you'll be dealing with this. Girl, within the first 24 hours of announcing it, I had, like, 4 people reaching out to me being like, "Can I have an hour of your time?" And,
Mm-hmm.
I think that, um, you don't realize how heavy the burden is when there's nobody there to catch it, right? So,
Yeah.
until you have a some way to let people use those systems to have those opinions, to say that to you, it's
Mm-hmm.
really easy to underappreciate how important that is. And like with this particular organization, when the CEO is a fantastic guy, he really cares about his stuff. And he was just flabbergasted because he was just like, I had no idea that
Mm-hmm.
my whole company had felt this dis-ease at not having, like, it was like they just multiple people went to him and were like, I just feel better knowing that there's somebody I can go to, that if I'm upset, if I'm concerned, if I'm whatever, like, that I can go somewhere and
Mm-hmm.
that's gonna be okay, um, to talk to them. And I think that it's the same kind of thing with DEI. I think that organizations don't realize how important it is to people who have been systemically marginalized to feel that there is a safe space and that that organization values creating that space enough that they have actually invested in it. But then the
Mm-hmm.
next step is to give them things that they can do, right? If they're toothless,
Yeah.
what's the point?
Well, I think, you know, a good way of kind of helping include people is creating like ERGs, employee resource groups, where they have each other and they can lean on each other. And for the first time, I'm a part of like ERG that actually does work. And I was in one of the meetings, this was a couple months ago, and we were talking about it's the LGBTQIA group. We were talking about creating dress code changes, and we had just gotten gender neutral bathrooms, and I mean like real changes that are happening in the company. And I like got really emotional about it and was like in tears because I remember that in high school being picked on, having like a friend of mine beat up for wearing a skirt to school You know, it's wild how much that has changed, and now we're actually supporting people and trying to create a culture that's safe. And it's just, it can be overwhelming emotionally to be included. It just means so much to people. And I really hope that this momentum that we're seeing continues. I don't know how optimistic I am, but I just think it's such a great thing to be able to speak freely at work, because you know, being yourself leads to creativity. And a huge part, which I did want to pick your brain on before we, I know we only have 5 minutes, but you know, you and I are both neurodiverse, and that is something that oftentimes is a hidden thing. And we're now seeing companies, you know, looking at that as a way to increase diversity. Do you see that changing positively in the future as well, or?
I hope so. I think that, neurodivergence is one of the areas that has had some of the least publicity. So there's the most immediate quick wins, as it
Mm-hmm,
were. So things like the fact that it's now increasingly publicized that if you are neurodivergent, you can absolutely request interview materials beforehand. I mean, anybody can request them, but you could make an ADA request that they would have to honor in order and give you those materials for what you're going to be asked, what the format is, etc., which makes a huge difference
mm-hmm,
to, some flavors of neurodivergence in terms of their ability to participate in the interview and perform well. So as more is being said, like, that's such a small victory that we can give that makes such a big difference. And that's what I
mm-hmm,
mean. Like, there's still a lot of low hanging fruit there, that we can give. And it's something that is, I think, there are some classes of marginalized groups that are exceedingly emotive. And we talked about before the last panel when we talked about that there's just something different. I can call out somebody for saying something sexist, and the emotive response to that is very different from if I call them out for being racist. Totally different.
mm-hmm.
Totally different, right? The emotional response to calling somebody a mansplainer versus telling somebody to check their white privilege, night and day.
Mm-hmm.
And so neurodivergence is one of the least emotive categories, right? Nobody feels some kind of way about people who are neurologically diverse. And it makes it a lot easier to give wins in that area. And I have found that when I'm dealing with clients that are resistant to change to policy from a DEI perspective, that actually I lean on the neurodivergent community a lot to be able to say, well, it would screen against neurodivergence. And they're maybe like, oh, well, we don't want to do that. Like, if I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, this is not great for trans people or what have you, they'll be like, do we care? What's the percentage of applicants? But neurodivergence, like, immediately, so I am hoping that A, gaining ground for that group is going to be quicker and easier than for some of the other groups. But that B, we can continue to leverage that kind of a crack in the veneer of existing business practice and standards to be able to widen it and get the big wins that we need for the other marginalized groups that do solicit more of an emotive response when you try to discuss them.
Yes, and neurodiversity does kind of branch into all the groups. I don't know any
Yeah.
group that it doesn't touch. So, yeah, it's
Yeah.
a pretty
And
awesome way to get. I didn't think of it that way, but yeah.
and as you say, it's invisible, right? So,
Mm-hmm,
and I think that as we learn more about it, we learn there's so much of a problem with underdiagnosis. So
mm-hmm,
many of us that are of, our kind of age bracket, right? We've become adults, and it's like all of a sudden somebody goes, you realize that you're spectrum, or you realize that my husband has been, is profoundly ADHD. I mean, like, girl, How anybody didn't know is amazing to me, but it's because his ADHD didn't present as an ill-behaved child that wouldn't sit down. It
Mhm.
presented as something that looked like inability to concentrate, erosion of executive function as he got more tired, mental fatigue, uh, memory, lack of short-term memory, all of those type of presentations, which are harder to quantify in a child.
Mhm.
And so now that he is a grown up 40-something-year-old man and it has been radically changing. And so I think that story is very non-unique in the current
Mhm.
sort of society. So I think that as more and more we're finding out that we ourselves or our best friends or our, moms, sisters, aunts, what have you, are this, and it's suddenly using that to explain and understand behaviors and struggles from a different perspective, it also allows there to be a continued light focused on that area, and again, without the weight of the other issues that go with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does. And I think, yeah, I mean, I had my diagnosis as an adult as well. And I think our generation was so anti-labeling. Like no one wanted any kind of label. If you remember, it was like, don't label, like no labels, no. So now it's like done a complete shift, a 180, where everyone wants a label for every single thing. So I don't know how I feel about that, because I grew up without labels and having like so many labels. I don't know how to deal with it, but it's interesting change.
Well, it was great, and so I got diagnosed with dyslexia, and I mean I'm, like, very dyslexic, um, at university, and I had spent my whole life being called lazy, and I was like, "I don't think that I'm lazy, I literally read those words differently, and it's interesting, like, having the label, doesn't affect me in so far in very much other than it's a really quick and easy way for me to explain things. So like my brain reads words slightly differently than other people. So I have a great candidate at the moment who we're probably going to hire for this particular role, and we think that they're fantastic. And their last name is not this, but the way my brain read their last name was risotto. And so that's it. They are, you know, the risotto candidate, at all times, and I'm like, "Hey, my dyslexia decided that this person is risotto, so we're just gonna roll with risotto because trying to tell my dyslexia something else is not gonna be a thing." I will make it take the effort if they start that's gonna and I'll just tell them. And I have a colleague whose, last name, my dyslexia decided was sassafras, and I just straight up told them, I was like, "Look, I know your last name is not sassafras, but my dyslexia has decided otherwise, and I use your last name so infrequently, it's probably not gonna fix itself." And that person just laughed, and they had a great sense of humor. They're like, "I can be sassafras. That sounds cool." And, like, they were fine. But by putting it in those terms, it makes it really easy for people like, now I'm not being a jerk, right? I'm not just not caring about your last name. I've given it some context that they can be like, "Oh, "Okay, I get it." Like,
Mhm.
dyslexic people's brains work differently. This is a clear example of that. Awesome. So, to me, that's kind of
Yeah.
how that works.
Yeah, and it's easy to find resources and to connect to other people that have similar experiences once you have the label. So for me, it was a good thing to have the neurodivergent labels, finally understanding why, oh, that's why I don't fit in this situation, or that's why I've always struggled with this thing.
Yeah.
So
I'm not a bad
it's,
person. I'm not
yeah.
stupid. I'm not lazy. I'm just neuroatypical. Well, shit, in that case, cool. I can quit beating
Mm.
myself up about that thing.
Yeah, there's a woman on LinkedIn that is autistic, and her name's Ellie. I can't remember her last name, but she posted a meme today, I think, or yesterday, that said, "Me, um, why don't I fit in?" And then society, "You're kind of weird." And then me, "I'm autistic." And then society, "But you seem so normal." Like, and I just thought it was hilarious. And she's like, what is it? Am I weird or am I normal? You
Absolutely.
know, like,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Nope, I feel that 100% for sure. Um,
yeah,
yeah,
we're going to wrap up and leave. Right. So we'll have to do another talk about neurodiversity in the future. But thank you, Michelle, so much
always
uh, for joining. And if you wanted to add your socials for people to follow you, please do so in the comments, and we will talk again.
perfect. Thanks for having
Thanks.
me. Always a
Thank you.
pleasure. Thanks.
Bye.